Thank you very much. And as Commissioner alluded to, there is more to Ontario than just Toronto, so I thought I'd take an opportunity to talk about not only the data needs in some of those municipalities, but some success stories from municipalities that are overcoming issues of uncertainty and acquisition. But I'll set some context before I get into that. So I will say that it's difficult to unequivocally say these are the data needs of small and medium-sized communities. They're all different. Some are rural, some are urban, some are peri-urban. So I don't want my message to be on behalf of every single municipality that isn't Toronto in Ontario. So I will mention that. I agree with David McLeod wholeheartedly that it's more than just about climate science. So you'll see my presentation sort of jumps between talking about climate science data and then other data needs, because I think that's really quite clear when you start talking to municipalities. So in this case, I'm using the broader term data, and if I mean science, I'll refer to that specifically. What is ICLEI? We're a hard beast to understand, but we've been around for 25 years. We used to be known as the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, but in the early 2000s, we rebranded as ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, looking at more holistically sustainability rather than just environment. We're about 1,200 municipalities around the world, working with about 200 municipalities in Canada, traditionally on climate change mitigation, but since about 2006, increasingly on adaptation. We're best understood by our mandate of connecting leaders, so bringing people together to have conversations and to exchange and network on these ideas by accelerating action through specific programs. We have the Partners for Climate Protection program we jointly run with FCM, and then also our Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities program, which I'll talk to a little bit about. And then we're a gateway to solutions, providing technical tools and resources and publications on issues of mitigation, adaptation, and increasingly biodiversity and urban nature. So a quick overview of what I want to talk about. I want to distinguish, build up a little case of producers versus users and then knock it down. Talking about uncertainty and this idea of avoiding lost in translation. I'll present 3 challenges and then 3 success stories and then wrap up. So hopefully keeping to my time frame. I think Ryan did a really good job of setting this context, but I just wanted to elaborate a tiny little bit. That data use really falls in our perception to 3 main categories. So this idea of, for research, so risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, decision support, which we in our purview call local action planning, what it is that you're going to do about the assessments you found and the risks you found. And then really importantly on outreach, and again, David McLeod alluded to it in his last hopeful considerations, that you need to get people to do things about those risks. The corporations themselves won't be able to do everything. So that outreach and communications component, I think, can't be overlooked, and can't be overlooked when the climate science is being provided to end users. And I really don't want to underestimate the importance of that scientific data for outreach. I mean, Ryan's charts were fantastic. I have to admit I understood a fraction of them. Maybe if I'd been given 3 days to look at that one that was really triangular, I might succeed. But I really want to stress that that translation piece is really important. Really building off of that chart, again, that Ryan had put up. Where are we now? I think understanding is clearly set. You know, we accept that the past is no longer a guide to the future. David, let me talk about that. We can't just look backwards. We need to have future projections. A lot of places have been identifying likely impacts and assessing what the risk and vulnerability of those impacts is. I think we're firmly rooted in that planning stage and developing adaptation options that are necessary to address this risk. And I think we're very slowly moving into this implementation and then monitoring and review track. I think the orange side of this slide isn't typically thought of as being supported by climate science, but I think it's really important in that there's indicator data required there, climate science for training and communications. So I think we can't say that the role of climate science is done as we move past red. It really is important as we're rounding that loop and continuing the iterative process. This is a chart that I've borrowed from the Climate Impacts Group out of the University of Washington. And I think we should walk through it a little bit. So on the left, we've got our square peg, let's say, the research community. Square only in shape, not in demeanor. And they've got traditional products that they produce. So publications, forecasts, they've got physical system models, hydrologic models, theoretical models, generally data. On the right, we have our round hole, again, only in shape. And they're, limited technical resources. They're working within a formal planning environment, very hierarchical management structure, and they're balancing the corporation's needs with stakeholder needs. And in the middle is that the considerations that climate impact science is meant to address. And the resource managers or decision makers are addressing it from one side, and the research community is addressing it from the other side. So can we find a way to merge that square peg and that round hole? And this is what this slide, and this is, I have to warn you, very advanced PowerPoint for me, so I want some ooh and ahs coming up. So again, on the right, we've got that square peg, and we've, current state of knowledge, emerging understanding, this idea of exploratory science, and pieces that aren't knowable anytime soon. And I think scientists accept that, but practitioners don't. They want an answer right now of, that storm sewer, how much water is it going to get in the next rainfall? So, as I was just saying, there's this place, time, and sector-specific requirement by the decision makers. And the information has to be actionable. It's not just enough to know it. Now that they know it, well, that legal liability piece is increasing if they know it but then don't do anything about it. So there's that piece. And this constant idea of best available science. So I'm putting up a little mock conversation of decision maker. I'm going to pick on Brian Montgomery from Hamilton. So he goes and says to our friend Ryan, we want to do a climate impact assessment. We need your finest resolution, and by that I mean finer, climate information. So Ryan asks him a question saying, well, how do your systems work? What's sensitive to climate? What do you understand your sensitivities to be? And what are those primary or preliminary risks that you're associating? So that's bringing those groups a little bit closer together, just a conversation. So Brian responds, well, it's complicated. We've got budget restrictions, regulation, we want this idea of resilience, everybody has to be involved, and that gets them to a sweeter spot. So Ryan comes back to him saying, well, what resources are you managing? What are your objectives to do that with, and under what time frames? And just this simple act of talking about needs and what the research producers can produce gets us to, see, there's the ooh and ah moment, thank you, of getting closer. So it's not just about knowing, well, end users need to have this and need to consider this when they decide on the information they need. It's that dialogue with the end user for your specific context. And also then who around you also needs that information. So can we cost share that burden of getting that information? So challenge one, working with uncertainty. There's been a lot said about uncertainty. I don't want to belabor the point, but these decisions are contentious. There's a lot of money involved. There's lawsuits involved sometimes, and potentially more. And some of the benefits are contentious. And then not to mention that they're not spread equally, right? Whose bridges and roads do you repair first? That's a whole other kettle of fish that we haven't even talked about. And this idea that it's a moving target. The science is evolving all the time. But what I want to talk to is that we make decisions about risk and costs and benefits all the time. We just don't talk about it in light of climate change. So terrorism threats, there's plenty of risk involved in that. It's even more uncertain than climate science, but we plan for it regularly at airports, at cities, at public institutions. So this is not an unsurmountable issue, this idea of uncertainty. What's the probability that the sun will rise tomorrow? Pretty good. It's not guaranteed, but do we need climate science to get to that level of certainty before we do something about it? I would argue we don't. And for most decisions, as Dave McLeod said, you can do something about it without knowing that level of detail. Now, the next slide came across my desk, and I had to share it because there are just some people we're not going to convince. So, an illusion. So, acquiring data is the next challenge. Again, I won't belabor the point. It goes without saying, money is an issue. Not everybody can afford to buy the data from private providers, as other municipalities can. I realize the goal is to have this publicly available, but even the fine folks at Ernos, budget is an issue, right? I mean, at some point, somebody has to pay for this. So whether it's hydro, whether it's governments, cost will always be an issue. But I think, again, we move forward on issues where cost is a stumbling block. I think there's an understanding of what data is needed as part of acquisition. What scale do we need it at, both spatial and temporal? What level of granularity do we need those numbers to be at? And it's not the same for everybody, so it has to be considered as by every end user, what point do they require that data set to? And then, as both the Davids before me have said, what variables do you need information on? And in priority. I mean, there were long lists of variables there, and they're probably not all going to happen to the same scale at the same time. I think there's a general sense when you get out to some of the smaller municipalities of, I don't know who can help me. So it's unclear where to even begin to get that data set. And it's not going to be the same across the entire province, unfortunately. And then lastly, will I understand the data that I get? And I think that's an important consideration. Quite often these requests are coming out of sustainability offices, environmental offices, or climate change officers that sit in the mayor's office. They're not climatologists, they're not meteorologists, they're often not engineers. So they may not be able to do anything with the end product that they get from one of the private providers. And I'll call this challenge 2.5. And because if we're going to talk about challenges of acquisition, I think it's only fair to talk about challenges of production. So I think from our perspective is that there's a lack of dialogue with local experts and practitioners as part of introduction. So there's this idea of we need to produce new research that's publication worthy, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the end user in mind. So we think we really need to bridge that gap, and we talk about this all the time, so I don't want to be too negative about it. Information sources for research practitioners to not serve only as information sources, so as providers of downscale GCMs, macro and fine-scale hydrologic projections, impact assessments, but really part of an outreach process. So I've been talking a lot about that outreach and communication side because I really think there's a role for the climate service providers in that space as well. And this is not to say that all climatologists and meteorologists need to now become communications and PR and marketing experts, but certainly that their organizations have those functions in mind as well. And really, if we're to help bridge, we must produce science that is both useful to, and this is the important part, used by the decision-making community. Because, Ryan said there's 21 sources of data, but who is using that? And how are they using it? So we need to consider that. And then my last point is this idea of avoiding lost in translation. I just love how dejected Bill Murray looks in this photo, because I think quite often our municipal staff feel like this at their desks. And so these decision makers are often the final translators. They're the ones that are taking the data that they get and trying to elicit a response by their fellow colleagues in the corporation, by their elected officials, and also by the community residents' business. So we need to better understand how to use scientific data to compel action by non-scientists. We're not only speaking to a scientific community. How do we do that? I think vivid local imagery that personally resonates with real analogies. So, if you're out in rural Ontario talking to maple syrup producers, talk about the effect on the maple syrup industry, not IPCC charts of, projections and temperatures and everything. And again, with imagery, think not of polar bears and ice flows, but of schools being flooded out and local places that people meet, the farmers market, things like that. So having belabored the challenges, my success stories. And I want to talk about 3 places, 2 in Ontario and 1 outside of, because I think the last one not in Ontario is an interesting case that we could all benefit from. City of Thunder Bay really did a 3-fold approach to get a robust data set. One of the interesting pieces is their use of citizen science. There's a local fellow there, retired professor, who has become the sort of local expert on wind. And so they spoke with him and said, we're getting all of our departmental heads and sort of stakeholders from within the corporation and Earthcare. Al, correct me, Earthcare is Thunder Bay, Earthwise is Sudbury? Other way around. Okay, so one of the Earths, forgive me. They got them together and he presented what the wind implications will be for the city of Thunder Bay. And it didn't cost them anything. This was just a hobby meteorologist who happened to do it, but has become somewhat of an expert on the community. They then worked with GLESA out of the University of Michigan, I think Elizabeth is here somewhere, and got some regional models based on the work that GLESA has been doing around the Great Lakes. So I think it was jointly with Ann Arbor, and they were able to get specific or somewhat specific data based on work that was being done outside of the community. And then the anecdotal evidence piece is really interesting. They had a PhD candidate there doing a comparative analysis of Churchill, Manitoba, and Thunder Bay. And he was looking at community perceptions of climate change. So what he did is he carried out door-to-door surveys in Thunder Bay saying, how do you think, as a resident, the climate is changing? And he heard all sorts of things based on, well, when I was young, we used to skate here, and now we can't, or things like that. And then he plotted that on a map. And so the city staff were given real data about what citizens felt. And so I think this threefold approach, because it's so varied, really built a robust picture of not only how the scientists are saying the climate will change in Thunder Bay, not only how local scientists are saying it is changing, but then also how local residents feel it's changing, which arguably to the politicians was the most important one. That's the only one they cared about. And so I think it's a really good success story that has led them to move through a planning framework fairly quickly without really any huge cost. My next one is Oakville, so I'm going to get Cindy to wave her hands. And I didn't know Cindy was going to be here, so this is just a fortuitous coincidence. But so Oakville has worked with us in our Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities program. And as part of that program, which I won't get into because I'm running out of time, received a climate science report. And so this climate science report really just synthesized all that publicly available data, or a lot of that publicly available data that Ryan was talking about. So Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, some provincial data, the Ontario Hazard Site when it was still around. But then what they did with that was really neat, was that they supplemented that with anecdotal research. So that was in media. When have they had big storm events, big flooding events? But then they also talked to their neighboring municipalities. So they talked to Peel and they talked to the Conservation Authority to sort of build up more than just what that climate science was able to provide. So more of an actual on-the-ground assessment. And I think because of those two approaches, correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy, you found that enough to run these vulnerability and risk assessments and move into planning. So overcoming this big uncertainty and overcoming the cost burden of commissioning data just for Oakville and saying there's enough study sites here in Southern Ontario and there's enough we can tell from our neighboring municipalities that they can do. Metro Vancouver, really quickly, is my non-Ontario one. It was a collaboration between 7 municipalities listed there, and they essentially said the impacts are going to be pretty close for us hydrologically because we're all in this Georgia Basin. So they worked with the University of Victoria, and they commissioned some downscaled hydrological modeling for all of them. The interesting piece is here, Vancouver obviously wanted really specific, what's the flow rate in that sewer at this time during this type of event. Some of the smaller municipalities, well, they just wanted to know, is it going to be more intense? Is it going to be more frequent? So they cost shared the data set, but got all of their individual requirements met. So this is a success story in figuring out how to share costs. And I can get into some of the details during the break or at the roundtable. I have 2 slides to go. So I wish I could say these were future considerations. I think they're more ongoing, is that there's a lot of useful information out there, but we need to support the partnerships that are required to define useful and to support their use. I also think fundamentally we have to be mindful of analysis paralysis, the state of overanalyzing a situation to the point where we're paralyzed into inaction. There is enough information to do something, and yes, some information is needed to do other things. So climate data providers must not just deliver that information, they must provide guidance and assistance on its use, and the need for this sort of translation, I think, is often overlooked when assessing resources needed to provide climate services. So I think training sessions on data, on the use of data, and on data support are a really important part of it. Thank you.